Hi, third graders. Today, we're going to learn all about comparing fractions using models. Our learning objective is to be able to compare different fractions using models of the same size, and I'm going to teach you how to do that. You can use fraction strips to show 3/8 and 5/8. Which fraction is greater, which is less? Let me show you an easy way to model this. Now, we have two fractions that we want to show. 3/8 and 5/8. If you draw one really big rectangle, like I'm doing here, and divide it into two totally equal size rectangles, you can show 3/8 and also 5/8. Now, the reason I made one really big rectangle is to make sure now that both of my holes are exactly the same size. And because they are both divided into eighths, I can divide the whole thing into eighths. Here's how to do that. I can divide it in half. Now I have two parts to the top piece and two parts to the bottom. Now I can divide it in half again, and that makes fourths. I do that by finding the middle of the halves. And then if I do that one more time and I find the middle again, now I have eighths. Now I can simply shade 3/8. There's 3/8. And I'm just using two different colors here just to show you. And it doesn't have to be perfect, it's just a model. You can make it neater on yours. And I use green. I can also show 5/8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5/8 goes all the way over here. So I always show kids this strategy for using fraction strips or fraction bars, sometimes they're called, to model fractions that are greater or less than each other. Now, if I use symbols, I can make a number sentence because I can clearly see with my eye which fraction is greater and which is less. I can write 5/8 is greater than 3/8, or I can write 3/8 is less than 5/8. So, boys and girls, this is a good strategy for using fraction strips to show 3/8 and 5/8 and figuring out which fraction is greater and which one is less. Now, use bar models to find the greater fraction between 5/6 and 3/4. You can use that same exact strategy I just showed you. We have two fractions here. Remember, you can only compare fractions from equal size wholes. So if you just make a big rectangle, just like I showed you a minute ago, you'll have two equal size holes. There are my two totally equal size holes. Now I'll make the top one show 5/6, and I'll make the bottom one show 3/4. Now remember, the denominator of a fraction shows how many equal parts I should divide it into. So the bottom bar here has to be 4 parts. So to make 4, I find the middle. That makes 2. I find the middle of those as best I can to make them as equal as possible. And there I have 4. Now, to do sixths, you have to do thirds first. That's the easiest way. So I'll show a third here. And I'll show a third here. And then I divide those in half. And now I have sixths. Now all I have to do is shade 3/4. and I'm not doing a super neat job. You'll do a neater job than I'm doing. Just want to show you quickly. There's 3/4. So there's 3/4. You can see how far it goes over. And I'll use a different color and show 5/6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So can you see with your eyes, boys and girls, which is the greater fraction? 5/6 or 3/4? If you said 5/6, you're right. It's bigger. So the number sentence can be 5/6 is greater than 3/4. Or you can also write 3/4 is less than 5/6. This is how you can draw your own bar models, boys and girls, to find the greater or the lesser fraction when you're comparing fractions from the same size whole. Let's see what your Math and Focus book says is a good strategy to use. Take a look. Can you see this in the model? Which is greater, 1/4 or 3/4? Well, the first example here are bar models. These are bar models. So 1/4 and 3/4. Those are easy to compare because they have the same denominator. They are called like fractions. Fractions with the same denominator. I'm going to point it out here. There's the denominator. They're called like fractions. When you compare like fractions, all you have to do is look at the numerator. The greater fraction is the one with the greater numerator because 1 out of 4 parts is less than 3 out of 4 parts. So these are bar models and these are circle models showing the same idea. You can use models to see with your eyes what fractions are greater, but without the models there, like fractions that have the same denominator means that you just have to compare the numerators. The numerator that's greater is the bigger or greater fraction. Take a look at these fractions. These fractions have the same numerator but different denominators. Which is less, 1/6 or 1/4? These are the models here. This is the bar model, circle models over here. Take a look. 1/6 and 1/4. Well, 1/6 is less than 1/4, and that's because, boys and girls, when you divide a whole into equal parts, the more parts you have to divide the whole into, the smaller the parts are. So the bigger the denominator, the smaller the piece. I always go back to the chocolate bar example. Would you rather have 1/4 of a chocolate bar or 1/12? Now, even though 12 is a bigger number, 1/12 is going to be a super tiny piece. So this is something you kind of have to remember, and you can always go back to drawing yourself a model if you forget. The lesser fraction is the one with the greater denominator. So the smaller fraction is the bigger denominator, kind of opposite we usually think. 6 is a bigger number than 4, but in fractions, 1/6 is smaller than 1/4 because 1/6 means 6 equal parts and 1/4 means 4 equal parts. And so the more pieces your whole is divided into, the smaller those pieces will be. The bigger the denominator, the smaller the part. Which is less, 5/6 or 5/8? Well, these have the same, again, the same numerators, 5/6 and 5/8. In this particular case, you have to ask yourself, because the numerator is the same, which pieces are smaller? Are eighths smaller or sixths? Well, the reason is, boys and girls, Eighths are smaller, and the reason is because the more pieces you divide your whole into, the smaller they will be. 5/6 is greater than 5/8, even though 6 is less than 8, because a whole divided into 6 equal parts, those parts are bigger than 8 equal parts. That's why. Since 5/6 and 5/8 have the same numerator, the lesser fraction is the one with the greater denominator. This sometimes confuses kids, but if you ask yourself, which pieces are bigger, sixths or eighths, it might help you visualize that eighths are smaller pieces. Okay, boys and girls, I'll see you next time. Your teachers will talk more about comparing fractions with you this week in your small group lessons. See you next time.